Just ahead, there's another edition of the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm Executive Producer Michael Yaffee.
A pleasure to be with you again this week, Michael. Today, our special guest, author Eric Eggers. He resides in Tallahassee. He's been in the media. Matter of fact, he admits to being a longtime listener of the Florida Roundtable. Don't let that out, though. But in any way, Eric has a brand new book. It's called Fraud, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election. There's a controversial title in and of itself, and we're going to ask him to explain all that and get his notions on how we're doing. Stay put. The Florida Roundtable begins in a moment.
Where do you want to go on a vacation or honeymoon? The Caribbean, Europe, Hawaii, Mexico? How about Disney or a cruise? At Superior Cruise and Travel, we've got you covered. We'll assign you your own travel concierge. They'll help you design a custom vacation plan that you can't find online. And the service is completely free. You can't compare the value of this to any other online travel company. We can help you plan a custom vacation anywhere in the world. We even offer payment plans with no credit card required. Now you pay off your vacation on your time schedule. Call now and mention the promo code RADIO and save up to $500. Book your custom trip. Call Superior Cruise and Travel now and talk to one of the highest-rated travel agencies in the country with a 5-star A+ online rating.
800-659-5087. 800-659-5087. 800-659-5087. That's 800-659-5087.
It was a great night partying and laughing with friends. That is, until you decided to drive impaired. Now there's thousands in fines, no license, and possibly jail time. And that's if everyone is lucky enough to survive. No fun at all. Celebrate responsibly. Use a ride service, call a friend, or have a designated driver. Always drive sober so that everyone can arrive alive. Brought to you by the Florida Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles.
Hey, it's Tom McCubbin here, and I'd like to tell you about this new cool turf that is unlike any other, Scott's Pro Vista St. Augustine, and it's now available across the state from the good folks at Bethel Farms. Scott's Pro Vista St. Augustine will give you complete weed control and 50% less mowing when compared to traditional St. Augustine. Less maintenance and easy weed control? Sounds good to me. To get this new turf for your lawn, visit BethelFarms.com for more information.
This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm Executive Producer Michael Yaffee.
Michael, a pleasure to be with you again this week. A little bit later on in the hour, our special guest, a gentleman from Tallahassee, Eric Eggers. He is the author of a brand new book from Reagan Publishing entitled Fraud, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election. Wow, you don't have to go much past the title page to figure out where that book's going.
Yeah, well, exactly right. Obviously, he has a strong point of view.
He certainly does, but we're going to ask him some questions about that and focus on some of the problems that we have here in Florida and also some of the high points. Everything is not bad in Florida, you know. Basically, this last time around, we came down to just a couple of counties, a couple of the same counties that we had problems with 18 and
yeah, what a
19
coincidence.
years ago.
Uh-huh.
Big question mark over. If you're driving south on 95 through Palm Beach or Broward County, watch out for the big question mark that is hanging over the area there as far
Right.
as elections are concerned. But voter suppression, Michael, you mentioned this, a word that maybe some folks aren't too familiar with, but a charge that is certainly out there in a big way these days.
Seems like it's out there in bigger ways than it used to be. When you look at the Georgia governor election especially, you have Stacey Abrams, who is basically saying that her loss was not legitimate, that the current governor-elect really isn't the legitimate winner because of, quote-unquote, voter suppression. And they've been saying it in Florida as well.
I don't understand voter suppression. Of course, I have a problem with a lot of this business. I go back to Richard Daley in Chicago when he used to say vote early and vote often.
So that definitely gave you a strong point of view on this.
It does. And to me, where some of our voting rules have gone is legalizing Mayor Daley's philosophy of vote early and vote. Well, you leave the vote off and off of that part of it. But it used to be considered it was a privilege to cast your ballot. And if the election was on a Tuesday, they're open for 12 hours. If you're in line when the polls close, they have to let you vote. And somehow or other, in that 12 hours, you found a few minutes to get to your polling place and make it happen because you wanted to participate in our democracy. And now it's just like, just vote any day you want.
Well, I know, they have early voting, they have absentee voting, then they have election day voting where it's all day, and still they claim voter suppression. Yeah. And we have record turnouts in both states, Florida and Georgia, and they're still saying, well, some votes were suppressed.
Yeah. One of the things they did in Louisiana a long time ago to help avoid this business, well, it's hard to vote on Tuesday. People work, Well, I don't know how many people are working. The hospital nurses, I guess, sometimes do the 12-hour thing. Louisiana moved all their state and local elections to Saturdays.
Yeah.
And it solved a lot of problems over there.
Australia does that. The country actually does that. They vote on the weekends, I think Saturday and Sunday.
Mm-hmm. So, there are ways around it, and I just question the necessity of, I'm not saying it's all wrong. We've done it, but it opens the door to all kinds of additional fraud, more so than we had over the years.
Well, the Florida election this year really kind of proved that because that's where a lot of the issues came from. It came from the early votes, the absentee votes, and they weren't counting them right. They weren't, submitting them right.
Yeah.
And it probably wouldn't happen as much if it was just the one-day voting, like you said.
And thank goodness we've done away with the punch cards.
Yeah, that is one good thing that came out of that problem.
No hanging chads, no dimpled chads, no butterfly ballots this time.
Filling in the bubble's pretty easy. If you can't figure out how to do that.
And there are people who do manage to screw it up.
Yep.
But, that's a story for another show. We will have to take a little bit of a pause along our network line here. We'll remind you that this is the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Michael Yaffee.
We'll be joined by author Eric Eggers as the conversation continues.
An opioid overdose does not need to end in tragedy. At-home rescue treatments like naloxone can help you save a life. Naloxone is available without a prescription and doesn't need to be administered by a health professional. Learn to recognize the signs of an overdose, like unresponsiveness, snoring sounds, and shallow breathing during an emergency. To learn more, dial pound 250 on your cell phone, say the keyword Save a Life, and you will have the option to receive a one-time auto-dial text message from iHeartMedia. Brought to you by the Florida Department of Children and Families. Standard message and data rates apply.
It'll never happen to me. I'll never need help. That's what every boater thinks. But then one day, you do need help. And you have no way of getting it because you thought having an emergency locator beacon was unnecessary. You're wrong. Emergency locator beacons are effective, affordable, and they save lives. Seriously. If not for you, do it for them.
Learn more about emergency locator beacons at myfwc.com. Brought to you by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission.
In a world of tiny tomatoes and backyard pests, one man and his better half dig deep to save backyard gardens.
Joni, stand by to upload expert videos.
Already loaded, Tom.
Wow, you're good.
You're not so bad yourself.
Tom and Joni McCubbin star in hisandhersgardening.com. Critics rave.
Tom and Joni, they really grow on you. 2 green thumbs up.
Don't miss hisandhersgardening.com.
Wow, your flowers are gorgeous. What's your secret?
It's no secret. It's Bare Advanced.
You mean these blue bottles?
Uh-huh. I protect my beauties with all-in-one rose and flower care. It's insect and disease control plus fertilizer.
Really? What's this 12-month tree and shrub protect and feed?
Oh, I use it on my trees. It kills bugs for up to a year, plus it feeds. It's that easy. Hey, where are you going?
To get my own. I want a great yard, too.
Bare Advanced. Get more from the blue bottle. Always read and follow label instructions.
We are back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Michael Yaffee.
And Michael, as promised, we are off to the Tallahassee area where we are joined by newsman, author, political raconteur extraordinaire, Eric Eggers. And Eric, welcome to the Florida Roundtable.
Thanks, Reagan. Thanks, Mike. It's great to be here. I'm a big fan of the show.
Well, thank you, sir. Before we get started, why don't you go ahead and take the first minute or so and tell us a little bit about yourself, your educational background, and how you ended up in the Tallahassee area, and how you came to write this book that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Reagan. I've been living in Tallahassee for some time. I attended school here in high school, and then I went to Florida State University, and I actually worked for one of your affiliates, WFLA, in Tallahassee, and produced the morning show here, and so became immersed and engaged with a lot of current affairs, and got to know a lot of the newsmakers and elected officials, and really I think that's really was the beginning of my journalism career. And actually in that process I met author Peter Schweitzer, who I don't know if you've had on as a guest before, but Peter's, a best-selling author. In fact, his last book was number one on the New York Times bestseller list, and he founded an organization about 6 years ago called the Government Accountability Institute, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank geared towards investigating cronyism and corruption in the federal government. And we attack both sides, and we really kind of try to pursue facts, not opinions, and go where the information takes us. And so I've been able to be a part of the process as with working with Peter and GAI. I've contributed to the book Extortion, which is about how members of Congress use their positions of power to kind of profit personally. I worked on Clinton Cash, which is his book in 2016, actually 2015, which exposed the overlap of people that donated to the Clinton Foundation that received favors from the State Department. And then his last book, Secret Empires, I worked on that as well, and that was the one that was number one. So I've been working at GAI for 6 years, and as part of that process, we're expanding, and I was part of a research investigation into double voting in the United States, and specifically with a Florida angle. And we found, and I can talk about this, it's a chapter in the book, but we found over 2,100 instances of double voting in the state of Florida in the 2016 election, which is, was quite interesting, because one of the things you hear about voter fraud is, well, it can't happen on a scale large enough to sway a national election. And when we found 2,166 instances of double voting in the state of Florida, which basically means people cast a ballot in the state of Florida and then cast a second ballot in a different state, we thought, well, wait a minute, that's 4 times the margin of victory, Reagan, I'm sure you remember, from the 2000 election, which basically was swung by 537 votes in Florida. So we thought, well, that's interesting and runs counter to this dominant narrative. So, why don't we see what the rest of the facts are? And that's basically was the beginning of the book, which came out in August.
And, of course, it is from Regnery Publishing. The title is Fraud, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election. Well, my goodness, there's quite an indictment right there just in the title, huh? Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. And I get a lot of second looks from people. And, obviously voter fraud's a controversial topic. And I think it's divisive immediately, because if you're on the left, like I have friends that are Democrats, and I told them, I'm writing a book on voter fraud, and they immediately said, oh, I guess you're learning to speak or write Russian then. Whereas people on the right believe that there is this vast conspiracy, and they believe that the Democrats actively work to steal elections. And so, what I try to do is take a look at the evidence, and to be honest, I think, where the subtitle comes from is how the left plans to steal the next election. The people on the right, they get accused of voter suppression. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised here in the early part of 2019, now that the House has gone back to the Democrats, if you see them maybe even hold hearings on voter suppression. But when it comes to actual voter fraud, I think it's far more likely, and the research I've conducted, the evidence suggests that actually it's the Democrats that perform and conduct operations that I think people would consider to be voter fraud.
Well, how exactly do they do it? Is it really just the close elections where this happens?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mike. So there's a number of manners, there's a number of ways in which I think voter fraud can occur. But I guess it's important to begin with that we define our terms because, one of the things that I've discovered is you get this dominant narrative that says, the left, voter fraud's a myth. It's as common as lightning strike. And if you kind of unpack that, you realize that the people that are saying that, they're funded by people like George Soros, which I document in the book, and B, they're using a definition that I think legally would be considered under-inclusive. So, they're defining voter fraud only as an act of impersonation by an illegal voter of a legal voter. And, what I discovered and what I think the research solidly shows is that there's lots of things that happen that, in my opinion, discount the true weight of an honest vote. And that's what I think most people would consider to be voter fraud. And the real kind of shame of it is, or the surprising part of it is that a lot of it's legal. So what does that mean, to get back to your question, Mike? So when people who are non-citizens legally get registered to vote, right, or they end up on voter rolls and they cast a ballot, like that's voter fraud. Those are illegal voters. They shouldn't be voting. When campaign operatives are allowed to go out and basically request absentee ballots on behalf of sometimes non-citizens, sometimes legal residents, sometimes senior citizens, a practice known as granny farming, and they request the absentee ballots, and then they're there when the ballots come back. I talk in the book about the former mayor of Eatonville, who was notorious for this, and ultimately, was reelected on the strength of absentee ballot fraud, and it would have been fine. Actually, the supervisors of elections in Orange County was going to let it go, but the lawyers for his opponents were able to raise the issue and get it blocked. In Palm Beach County, Susan Booker, who's been in the news a lot lately, she found 300 absentee ballot request forms that had the same signature. And she flagged, she said, I know this is a problem, but state law mandated that she send the actual absentee ballots to the voters. And then they had 22 signed voter affidavits from people that said, no, look, campaign operatives came and filled out my ballot. One guy was legally blind, that is to say visually impaired, and said, no, I can't even see, and I know somebody filled out my ballot because I didn't do it. And yet no charges were filed. So there's a lot of different ways in which things can happen, but I think the big thing is that we get people that shouldn't be voting registered to vote, and then from there it's almost impossible to keep them from voting.
It's a very multifaceted and complicated program. One of the things, and I'm maybe stepping a little bit out of order here, but I wanted to ask you about, and that is one of the things we heard this time around was mismatched signatures on the mail-in voting. And places like, I believe it's Washington State, they do all of their elections, everything, by mail. And I wondered if you had the opportunity, did you look at them? Can we learn anything from them? How does that stack up?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's actually a few states that conduct all their voting by mail. And, I think if you're doing it all one way, then I think you can try to implement different procedures and protocols. But I would say of all the different forms of voting, absentee balloting, in my opinion, is by far the most susceptible to corruption or fraud, just because it's the most like an honor system. It's funny. We have a history of voter fraud in this country, and I have a chapter in the book about how, we all the way back to George Washington, elections used to be held in taverns, and George Washington actually lost his first election because he was serving beer for his voters, and his opponent was serving rum. And so, his next bid, they made sure to improve the menu, so to speak, and he was successful. But the concept of absentee balloting or voting not in the precinct actually dates back all the way to Louisville. And it was because this guy that ran criminal operations in the city and was able to successfully make sure his candidates were elected to police chief and things like that, he had this sense that his guys were going to lose. So he did what any good, aspiring, criminal lord would do, and he changed the law. So they made it so that you could go and they were going to count votes in people's homes. And luckily he was successful. So I say all that to say, the problem with absentee balloting is you take what I think limited levels of oversight we have when we conduct elections and you eliminate them. And it essentially becomes this honor system. And so, in terms of the voter signature mismatch, like, I understand the frustrations. I think it was Representative Murphy who said, hey, look, I was just told my ballot didn't count because my signature didn't match. And that's obviously not ideal. But the reality is that when you're filling in and when you're sending in an absentee ballot, your signature essentially becomes one of the only identifying marks that shows the person that requested the ballot is the person that's registered to vote and is the person that's sending in the ballot. So I think it just speaks to if we're going to get rid of the signature verification piece of it, well, what do we have left to ensure that the right people are actually sending in the ballots?
So when I talk to Democrats, most of the time they'll admit that there are some cases of voter fraud, but that it's such a small amount that it's really not a big problem in this country. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I would say, how can you be sure? Because one of the things that I was quite struck by is when you speak to election officials, and even when you kind of start to unpack the levels of oversight, no one's really watching for voter fraud. So I think that was one of the things that really stood out is in my research and the examples that I have in the book. The people that write about it, it actually ends up being the media and lawyers. The voter fraud's not actually caught by the elected officials. Like, their job, their mission is to try to make sure as many people are voting as possible, and they want to conduct fair and accurate elections. But their bias is to make sure that they're not keeping people from voting, which is appropriate, right? I think as American citizens, we should want all legal and eligible voters to be able to vote. So, kind of the example I use is so we haven't seen very many people caught for voter fraud. Well, if you drive, as many people did over the holiday weekend, last weekend, you might have seen a few people pulled over for speeding. Does that mean those are the only people that were speeding? Or is it just that the systems that we have in place are insufficient to properly document the level of violation? Now,
Eric, I tell you what, hang on to that thought for a moment. We've got to the point where we've got to take a break here along the network line. We'll come back and let you finish that up. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Michael Yaffee.
Our very special guest today, Eric Eggers, visiting from Tallahassee. He is the author of Fraud, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election. It's from our friends at Regnery Publishing, available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com. Stay put. The conversation continues in a moment.
Are you worried about your mom or dad living alone in their house? Hi, I'm Joan London. Listen, I know how difficult it is to find senior care for someone you love. That's why I recommend a free service called A Place for Mom. They are the nation's largest senior living referral service. Call A Place for Mom today.
To receive free information on senior living communities in your area, call A Place for Mom at 1-800-750-4356.
A Place for Mom offers free one-on-one advice from local advisors and a personalized list of senior living communities you can visit. If you have questions about senior care for your mom or dad, there's a place for answers, A Place for Mom.
Call A Place for Mom in the next 10 minutes to get your free ebook on financing senior care as well as free information on senior living communities in your area. Call 1-800-750-4356. That's 1-800-750-4356.
Florida's boating environment is always changing. New sunsets, new experiences that you won't find anywhere else on Earth. But one thing that never changes: boating while impaired by drugs or alcohol. It's illegal in the state of Florida. Boating under the influence will land you in jail, or worse, kill someone you love. It's just simply not a risk worth taking. Learn more about Florida's boating laws at myfwc.com. Brought to you by the FWC Division of Law Enforcement.
Your yard's days of being picked on are over, thanks to the science of Bear Advanced Brush Killer Plus. Its penetrating formula is specifically designed to kill hard-to-control brush, like kudzu, poison ivy, poison oak, and wild berries, roots and all. And the concentrate product even kills stumps, so your yard never has to worry about being bullied. Bear Advanced. Get more from the blue bottle. BearAdvanced.com. Always read and follow label directions.
Terrorist acts and shootings are often described as great tragedies. They are not. We live in a world so concerned with being politically correct that they're afraid to call evil what it is, evil. Man's sin nature is as old as the Garden of Eden. Many love to blame culture, poverty, or lack of education and opportunity as the problem. They may have a good or bad impact, but the big problem is sin. Acknowledging our sin nature will show us our need for a Savior who changes us from within. That Savior's name is Jesus. He came to die for the sins of all who will acknowledge their sin. Faith in Him strikes a mighty blow at evil. So quit calling man's evil acts a tragedy. They are evil and God hates it. Yet thankfully He loves us in spite of our evil and sin. Jesus not only forgives us, but gives us the want to overcome evil with good. This is Brian Wright, speaking right from my heart.
All right, crew, let's get her dug.
Honey, want to give me a hand? I'm planting that tree, remember?
No matter how large or small your digging project may be, no matter how urban or rural, you must always call 811 before any digging project. 811 is our national one-call number, alerting your local utility companies to come out and mark any lines they have near your dig site. You must call 811 at least 2 to 3 business days before any digging project, so you can avoid hitting our essential buried utilities. This includes natural gas and petroleum pipelines, electric, communication cables, and water and sewer lines. So before you do this or this, make sure you do this. For digging projects big or small, make the call to 811. Brought to you by Common Ground Alliance.
From Pensacola to Key West and all points in between, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Michael Yaffee.
Our very special guest today is Eric Eggers. He is the author of a brand new book from our friends at Regnery Publishing, Fraud, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election. You can find more information about it. Of course, they have a website, voterfraud.com. The book is available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and Amazon.com, places like that. And Eric, you were right in the middle of a thought there, and I wanted to go back and allow you to finish up your notions on Mike's last question there.
Yeah, no problem. And I appreciate Mike. Mike's question was basically, how do we know? I mean, how big of a problem is it really if we've only ever seen limited instances of voter fraud be sort of flagged? And, the example I use is that, listen, just because you only see a few people pulled over for speeding doesn't mean that that's all the people that are actually violating the law. Because to me, there's a couple of key things to remember. Is it's quite easy to become registered to vote when you shouldn't be registered to vote. Basically, where the subtitle for the book comes from, like how the left plans to steal the next election, is because we lay out, I think, a very convincing fact pattern that people like George Soros and Tom Perez, who's the head of the Democratic National Party, they basically fund groups that do two things. Number one is they fight any effort by states to make elections more secure. And actually, in the state of Ohio, Reagan, I know you worked in Ohio previously, the state of Ohio ahead of the 2016 election, that's a great example of this because the state of Ohio had to fight efforts to both remove illegal voters from their voter rolls and implement their voter ID laws. Now, the state of Ohio was successful in the Supreme Court. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they ruled 5-4 that the state of Ohio was correct in their interpretation of the law, in which they removed people that shouldn't be registered to vote in Ohio from those rolls. But they still had to fight Soros-funded lawsuits to do so. In fact, the lawyer that Bill Nelson used in his latest recount battle, Mark Elias, was one of the lawyers that Soros funded to do that. And, it's interesting, one of the groups that Mark Elias filed the lawsuit on behalf of was actually a group called Ohio Organizing Collaborative. And, they ended up having an employee arrested for voter fraud. But, so they try to fight against those types of things. They try to fight against implementation of voter ID. And at the same time, right, they fund a lot of these groups like the Acorns and the Razas that go out and they round up and they register to vote as many people as possible which sounds great in theory. The problem is that many of them shouldn't actually be registered to vote. We've got major issues in terms of the error rate in voter registration in this country. I mentioned in the last segment how, as part of the research for this book, we found over 2,100 instances of double voting in the state of Florida alone. So that's actually not that surprising when you consider that the Supreme Court even has cited statistics from the Pew Center that nearly 3 million people are registered to vote in more than one state. And 24 million voter registrations in this country, that's 1 in 8, are flawed or completely inaccurate. In fact, even President Obama's Commission on Election Administration that was issued in 2013, they found that it's 14 million or 16 million voter registration problems. So no one disputes that we have issues in terms of the error rate in terms of voter registration. There's 248 counties where you have more people that are registered to vote than you have citizens of legal voting age.
Mm.
So, so this is a long way of saying, Mike, let's survey the landscape, because if you believe voter fraud is not a problem, then you have to believe that, the elections are fairly accurate in terms of the infrastructure and the accounting systems. And we just know that that's not the case. Or you have to believe that there aren't groups that are organized and motivated to try to alter the outcome of the elections. And I also don't believe that that's the case. Even down in the recent recount in Florida, right, we saw 108 attempts to double vote in Miami-Dade alone. So that means 108 people. Forget about voting in Florida and voting in a different state. That's people voting in Miami-Dade either early or via absentee, and then showing up to cast a second ballot in the same election. That's pretty gutsy. We know non-citizens have attempted to cast ballots in Palm Beach County. We know illegal ballots were counted because of Brenda Snipes in Broward County because they were incapable of keeping them separate. In the state of New York, and this is maybe one of my favorite stories from the book, we know that we have all these problems on the voter rolls. The question is, how easily are they exploited? Well, this is the question that the city of New York wanted to answer. So they sent undercover agents into different precincts in New York City, and they were going to vote in different boroughs all over just to see, we know there's people that shouldn't be voting and that are on the voter rolls. How easy is it for these undercover agents to impersonate these voters? And these undercover agents attempted to cast a total of 63 ballots, and they were casting ballots in races that would be not competitive, so they knew they wouldn't be swaying the outcome. And of those 63 attempts to cast a ballot, 61 of them were successful. And in fact, one of the only 2 times in which the undercover agents were unsuccessful in casting an illegal ballot is because one of the undercover agents was attempting to cast a ballot on behalf of a felon that was incarcerated, and only because the felon's mother was actually working the polling place was the undercover agent turned away. So we know that they're easily exploited, and we know the problems exist. And so I think, unfortunately, that what the nation saw with the whole Florida recount is just how problematic and vulnerable the systems can be.
I find myself thinking back, Richard Daley Sr., the mayor of Chicago, 1960, last of the old-time big city machine Democrat mayors, very famous for vote early and vote often, voting the cemeteries, waiting till 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, all the other votes are getting counted. You see how many you need to win by, and all of a sudden they're finding bags full of votes, and they're linked to cemeteries, and they get counted. And it was a different kind of fraud then, but I find myself wondering, how far have we come? Are we doing any better? We got all this technology now, but we still have problems.
It's a great point, Reagan, and I think it's a point I try to raise when I speak about this, because no one disputes that voter fraud is ingrained into the fabric of our nation. Everyone sort of brags, Kennedy, and luckily they're voting in the cemeteries, and LBJ with documented examples of ballot stuffing. And so I think it's a great leaping off point to say, well, listen, if we know it used to happen, what makes us think that it doesn't happen anymore? Is it because we're somehow more ethical as a society? Are our political machines somehow less interested in modifying or altering outcomes? Is it because our election systems have become so much better at being accurate and identifying bad actors? And I think the answer to all those things is no. So then it's like, well, what other conclusion can we draw? And, and that's one of the things that I think people take away from the book. I've spoken to a group of election lawyers, and these are people that have worked as prosecutors and they've worked as judges. And so they've seen it, right? I think, the key is there really is quite a gap between the dominant media narrative and the reality on the ground. And the people that work on the ground are saying, I've seen these cases show up firsthand. I've seen, as a prosecutor, I've been presented with evidence, but then, I have to ask myself the question of, do I want to waste political capital prosecuting voter fraud if that there's all kinds of social repercussions? And, quite honestly, if I have limited resources in my office, why shouldn't I be going after, violent offenders or people committing financial crimes? So, I think all those things kind of combine to lead us to where we are today.
So you're talking about the fact that voter fraud definitely exists. Is there anything that has worked to prevent voter fraud? Like a lot of states have voter ID now. Is that actually working to prevent it?
Well, that's a great question, Mike. I think one thing is for all that he brings to the table, the fact that Donald Trump is talking about voter fraud has made it a forefront issue for certain states and certain officials. So you're starting to see states like Texas really crack down on it. It's one of the reasons why you're seeing a lot of news about attempts at voter fraud come out of Texas, right? We saw documented evidence of Texas Democratic Party officials sending voter registration forms to non-citizens with the box that says, yes, I'm a citizen, check, and, yes, I'd like to register to vote. The state of North Carolina, I think it was actually Homeland Security officials were able to go through and they identified 18 people that were committing voter fraud, and so I think charges were pending there. I think voter ID laws are a step in the right direction, but they're only a step, and here's why. First, it's important to remember that one of the critiques you hear about voter ID laws is that, somehow it's racist or it's oppressive to minority voices. And I would just say the evidence doesn't support that. In fact, states like Georgia and Alabama have actually seen increases in minority voting after they implemented voter ID laws.
All right, Eric, tell you what, we've got to pause again. Hold that thought. We'll come back and finish it up. But the clock tells us we must take a stop here and remind folks that they are listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Michael Yaffee.
Our very special guest this day from Tallahassee is Eric Eggers. He is the author of a brand new book, Fraud, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election, from our friends at Regnery Publishing, available at all the fine bookstores around Florida. Places like Amazon.com. You can check voterfraud.com. We invite you to stay put. Our conversation continues following these messages.
For families facing the challenge of a loved one with an opioid use disorder, it's important to know that shallow breathing, snoring, or gurgling sounds and unresponsiveness can be signs of an overdose. In the event of an emergency, an at-home treatment like naloxone can help save a life. To learn more, dial pound 250 on your cell phone and say the key words "save a life." You will have the option to receive a one-time auto-dialed text message from iHeartMedia. Brought to you by the Florida Department of Children and Families. Standard message and data rates apply.
Florida has over 2,000 miles of shoreline, over 4,000 square miles of lakes, and over 11,000 miles of rivers, streams, and waterways. Which means no matter how big your boat, how bright your life jacket, how loud you shout, finding you in the case of an emergency is going to be really difficult. Unless you have an emergency locator beacon. Odds are you'll never need it. But the odds for you are tremendously better if you ever do.
Learn more about emergency locator beacons at myfwc.com. Brought to you by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission.
It's happening to you every night. One snores and the other can't sleep. It seems like there's no end to it. But now there's a quick and easy-to-use solution. A natural solution. Snore Stop. Try it risk-free today. Snore Stop was created and tested by a team of physicians and has been helping couples sleep for over 20 years. It is the #1 selling anti-snoring medicine in the U.S. Snore Stop sprays or tablets are now available nationwide. All you have to do is call. It's time to try Snore Stop and make every night a better night for both of you. Don't wait. Try Snore Stop, the #1 selling anti-snoring medicine in the U.S. spray or tablets. Call right now for free shipping and your 100% risk-free trial offer. 800-960-4918. 800-960-4918. 800-960-4918. That's 800-960-4918.
We are back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Michael Yaffee.
Our very special guest this day is Eric Eggers, author from Tallahassee. His brand new book, Fraud, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election. Yes, you heard me right. It is from Regnery Publishing. It's available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com. You can find more information about it at the website voterfraudbook.com. And Eric, as we went into that last break, you were talking about the values and uses and the parameters of voter IDs, and I wanted to let you finish up that thought.
Well, just the idea that you get a lot of pushback from people saying requiring ID is somehow is racist, but there's really no evidence to support that. But it's not a complete and total solution, because there's actually a number of municipalities that the threshold to get an ID is not the same as the threshold to be legally able to vote. I mean, there's over 1 million illegal immigrants in California that have driver's licenses. Cities like Chicago and San Francisco and New York are actually issuing municipal IDs, so that that people, regardless of their citizenship status, have an identification that you would otherwise be able to use to vote. And by the way, non-citizens are allowed to vote in certain local and regional elections, and all that does in terms of the landscape of how secure does it make our federal elections is I think it just increases confusion and I think increases the odds that non-citizen voting is going to occur at a significant level. So, I mean, it's important to remember that Tom Perez, who's the head of the Democratic National Committee, has been working, before he worked for the Obama Justice Department, worked for an organization called Casa de Maryland. And Casa de Maryland is a nonprofit like Acorn and the Roth that's funded by George Soros, and they've advocated consistently for the expansion of non-citizen voting rights. In fact, Tom Perez's hometown of Tacoma Park, Maryland, has been allowing non-citizen voting since 1992. And actually, for the first time ever, a majority of Democrats, according to a Rasmussen poll, show that 53% of Democrats favor illegal immigrants having the right to vote. And so you combine this kind of surge in this thinking with a landscape that's permissive and allows non-citizens to vote in certain elections, and you've got people with IDs, and so so I think requiring ID alone is not sufficient. You've got to be able to have, I think, verification of citizenship for voter registration when it comes to federal elections, and sadly, that's not occurring. And here's why it's sad, because what it ends up doing, and I know, and I'll wrap this up quickly, is it ends up victimizing non-citizens who I don't think are necessarily nefariously trying to go out and manipulate elections for Democrats. I think they just don't know what the law is. In the book, I have several examples of people that are both non-citizens and felons that I think were well-intended, people just trying to participate in the American system, and they voted illegally just because it was so easy to do so, and they were actually encouraged to do so by these political operatives. Well, they have real consequences for that. They face deportation and even prison time. In fact, there was a young woman, or actually a male priest in Illinois who moved here in 2006 and has lived an exemplary life, and was trying to become an American citizen, but it was discovered as part of that process that he'd voted illegally in 2007. And so now he has to go back to England and start the process back over again. So by keeping the system so vulnerable, I think it ends up victimizing these populations like immigrants that people on the left, claim they want to protect.
I want to talk for a minute or two here about Brenda Snipes. Of course, she at the center of the Broward County brouhaha this time around. She did end up submitting her resignation. But this is the same woman who was appointed. Jeb Bush comes out of retirement and calls for her to resign. He is the guy who appointed her to replace Miriam Oliphant. Tell us a little bit about this Brenda Snipes lady.
Well, it's important to remember, and because I think you covered when Miriam Oliphant was removed, right? And fun fact, yes. When they escorted her out of her office, this is Brenda Snipes' predecessor, they discovered stacks of unopened ballots from the previous election in her desk drawer. So unfortunately, the question is this a Brenda Snipes problem or is this a Broward County problem? What we do know is that Brenda Snipes hasn't improved things. It's maybe not a great sign when the Supervised Elections website touts that in her 15 years of service that Dr. Snipes has overseen, quote, several successful elections. So unfortunately, 2018 was not one of them, and her track record is littered with missteps and violations of the law, whether it's admitting to allowing illegal immigrants or felons to vote, whether it's destroying ballots in violation of the law, whether it's opening ballots in violation of the law outside the presence of other elections officials, and then when she's challenged on it, claiming in court that she doesn't understand the meaning of the word canvassing in terms of, well, why weren't you allowing canvassing officials in the room to do that? So, yeah, it's not been a great end to the tenure of Dr. Snipes. And, the biggest problem I have, and, other people will speculate about, well, these 83,000 ballots that showed up from what we said with the total number of votes cast on election nights and then the actual number of votes that we've seen cast, how do you explain that disparity? And, I actually think it's par for the course. They've got a history of misplacing ballots and not being able to keep tabs on them. But, the point I like to make is, look, if they're this bad at keeping track of them and actually counting the ballots, how good of a job do you think they did at preventing illegal ballots and illegal voters from casting ballots? And so, I think that's where we should really be concerned. And then from there, you had all these lawyers fighting, and I think that was basically about trying to see which laws on election day will not be enforced. And that was, in my opinion, the real test case for what we'll experience here in 2020.
Eric, we only have less than a couple of minutes here, but without giving too much away, a couple of the recommendations that you might make that come out of the book to prevent this kind of fraud and stealing of the next election.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that for all the things that we do right as a country, and by the way, not all elections officials are like Brenda Snipes, right? In Leon County, where I live, we have Mark Early, who does an excellent job. His predecessor, Ian Sancho, I think, set the national standard in terms of election administration. So we should feel good about we do have professionals trying to do their best job. But the fact remains that we are a third world country in terms of election technology. I mean, Estonia is using blockchain technology to conduct their elections. And that's actually something that the state of West Virginia did recently to allow people from overseas to vote via their mobile phone. So I think we've got to have a massive investment in terms of technological upgrades for what we're doing. And I think at some level we need to have verification that the people that are registered to vote are people that should be registered to vote, because there are massive gaps in terms of that level of oversight. And in often cases, it just doesn't exist. It's too much. It's like a baseball game where the second base umpire may have information, but you got to ask him before he's going to tell you. You've got a lot of these state agencies or federal agencies that aren't talking to one another.
Eric, we are going to have to leave it there, and I'm very sorry about that. But we want to say thank you for your time this day. We could go on for a couple more hours very easily here. Eric Eggers, the author of Fraud, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election. It is from our friends at Regnery Publishing, available at Amazon.com. All the fine bookstores, and voterfraudbook.com will get you some highlights. Eric, we will visit again. Thank you so much, sir.
Thanks, Mike.
You are listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Michael Yaffee.
And Michael and I will be back with a brief closing thought following these messages.
If you're feeling grumpy this morning, try thinking about all of your blessings. As you think of them, is there a common thread through the blessings? For me, the greatest blessings are in relationships. I've been blessed with Christian grandparents and parents and great siblings and an incredible Christian wife. We're blessed with 3 sons along with their wives that all have real relationships with the Lord. And through them has come the blessings of grandchildren. And you know what? I can't take credit for any of these blessings, these relationships. None of these relationships are perfect, but they are healthy. For that, I am thankful. So is there a perfect blessing through relationships? Yes. His name is Jesus. He is the perfect gift to save us from our flaws, to transform us into the person God created us to be. And that, my friends, is the greatest blessing of all. This is Bryant Wright, speaking right from my heart.
Visit rightfromtheheart.org and click Devotions to read the daily devotion and send to a friend.
Are we there yet?
There's nothing better than a fun family road trip.
Come on, are we there yet?
Don't let a bad tire get between you and your destination. Before hitting the road this holiday season, make sure your tires are properly inflated, damage-free, and have adequate tread depth, including the spare tire. Inspect your tires regularly and keep your family happily rolling down the highway on safe tires. Brought to you by the Florida Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles.
Hey, it's Tom McCubbin here, and I'd like to tell you about this new cool turf that is unlike any other. Scott's Pro Vista St. Augustine, and it's now available across the state from the good folks at Bethel Farms. Scott's Pro Vista St. Augustine will give you complete weed control and 50% less mowing when compared to traditional St. Augustine. Less maintenance and easy weed control? Sounds good to me. To get this new turf for your lawn, visit BethelFarms.com for more information.
In a world of tiny tomatoes and backyard pests, one man and his better half dig deep to save backyard gardens.
Joni, stand by to upload expert videos.
Already loaded, Tom.
Wow, you're good.
You're not so bad yourself.
Tom and Joni McCubbin star in hisandhersgardening.com. Critics rave.
Tom and Joni, they really grow on you. 2 green thumbs up.
Don't miss hisandhersgardening.com.
Employ Florida offers resources and services to help you find employment.
Hi, Gary here. Employ Florida helped me improve my interview skills, plus write a great resume. I attended networking events with many employers and other industry professionals just like me. With the workshops and training found at employflorida.com, I was able to land a great job in my field.
Job resources, real results, hired. Employflorida.com. That's employflorida.com.
We are back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Michael Yaffee.
And I enjoyed that conversation with Eric Eggers, and many times the clock does tend to run a little bit too fast on us.
Well, there's a lot going on dealing with this topic right now. So
yeah, there surely is. And I had questions I didn't even get a chance to talk about. I mean, I grew up cutting my teeth on elections in Cuyahoga County, which is the home of Cleveland. We talked about Chicago and Richard Daley. I personally watched much of these things happen in the Cleveland area, where precincts waited till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning to see how many votes a particular candidate would have to win by. And, oh, look, there's a bag of votes over there behind the door. We forgot to send those in. And this went on year after year after year. You know?
Wow.
And, of course, now with computerized things, I suppose they've changed all that. I didn't get to comment on that, but I've been around long enough that I've watched these changes.
It sounds like it, yeah.
But it's interesting. Mike, very quickly, you got a couple other venues that you hold forth on.
Yeah, just follow me on Twitter at Beyond Reason R, or follow my show Beyond Reason Radio on iHeartRadio.
All right, and I think you'll like what you find there. We do want to say thank you for your time this day. We know you have lots of choices out there. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Michael Yaffee.
We'll invite you to join us again 1 week from now for another edition of the Florida Roundtable.
You've been listening to the Florida Roundtable, a news and public affairs presentation of the Florida News Network. The views and opinions expressed during this show are solely those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station's management, ownership, or sponsors. Please email your comments to Reagan Smith at fnnonline.net.